In the 1950s, a young secretary who was working the front desk at a company, she recognized this guy who came in. He was unique, and she thought this guy could really help the organization. And then when the president, who was her boss, returned, she gave it to him and was really hopeful that something would happen. Unfortunately, the boss kind of took a look and put it to the side, wasn't interested. Now, I'm sure all of you can kind of relate to that, right? You've been in that situation where you feel like you haven't been heard. You feel like something important is in front of you, and you're facing a situation where you have to make a decision. Where you have to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to pursue this, you're going to have that conversation, or whether or not you're just going to let it go. And in her case, I'm sure she kind of went back and forth, like, does this really matter? Does it not matter? I mean, after all, something like this really wouldn't change history. What I'd like to offer you is 3 tips that will help you today to become better at difficult conversations. My sister, at the 11th hour, she decided to go to college out of state. And literally as she was walking out the door, she tossed me the leash to her dog and said, "You're in charge of Cosmo," who was probably the worst behaved dog I had ever met. But my sister gave me this one parting word. She said, "Hey, I've signed you up for doggy obedience class. You're gonna be just fine." That first Thursday night with Cosmo was an absolute disaster. And over the next several weeks, I learned that there were really 3 keys to having success with Cosmo. And those keys were having the right temperament, first and foremost, having to respect the dog. The other 2 were tone and timing. I could say the right thing, but if I didn't have the right voice, Cosmo was very sensitive, and she could sense that. She knew when I wasn't being sincere, and she usually didn't respond very well. And the same thing was true with my timing. If it was on my time, that always didn't work. So when I could get those 3 things together, the right temperament, the right tone, and the right timing, I found success with Cosmo. I want to think about these as it relates to having difficult conversations. We think about employees. In today's market, I'm sure many of your companies, much like mine, one of our biggest challenges is hiring and retaining employees. How many employees are lost because either a supervisor or the employee themselves were not able to have a difficult conversation? I'm sure you've all seen this, right? By a show of hands, how many see this as the old woman? And how many of you see it as the young woman? If you hadn't seen it before, you just couldn't fathom how the people on the other side of the room saw it different than you. And it illustrates that point of we see life differently. And oftentimes there's other people who see life or see things the same way as we do. And sometimes there's people who see it vastly differently. Now, this is an acute issue in today's society, right? We're facing this issue of polarization, where we see these as black and white. You see it as young, you see it as old, and there's no middle ground, and you're right, and you're wrong, and you're wrong, and you're right. Temperament really leads to tone. Because how do we treat people who we love and care about and respect? What type of tone do we use in talking to them? Now, Stephen Covey is famous for saying, "Seek first to understand before being understood." As we seek to understand and as we ask questions, it takes some of that frustration, some of that heat out of the conversation. And it allows us to really start to get to the root of what's there. It also helps us to get past our stories, because as we ask questions, we might realize that how we see and how we perceive things might not really be how they are. The time to have a crucial conversation is in the moment. How many of you are adept at having a crucial conversation in the moment? Boy, no hands. That's scary, isn't it? So my advice is, if you can't do it in the moment, do it as soon as possible. Don't wait to have that conversation. So going back to 1954, a woman by the name of Marion Kursker was the receptionist at Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee, when a young man with a distinct sound that she had never heard before in sideburns came in to record a record. Marion made a recording and shared it with her boss, Sam Phillips. Sam Phillips didn't like it. He passed on it. And it was at that moment that she realized that she had to have that difficult conversation. Those difficult conversations, they can change your life and they can change history. Thank you.